wealthbranch.com.
Relative valuation, four-step process. This four-step relative valuation process comes from the famed professor and investor Aswath Damodaran. Step 1. Define the multiple. A multiple is a method of relative valuation where you compare the quantity of two numbers like price divided by earnings, then compare that number corresponding to its peers, like the P/E ratio of car companies like Tesla, General Motors, and Ford. The reason to define the multiple is your definition and method of estimation of a multiple and someone else's definition of a multiple might be different. Something as simple as a P/E ratio can be defined in different ways by different people. You must understand how a multiple was estimated when it was prepared by someone else. Checking for consistency. According to Aswath's four-step process, the first thing we need to do is check if the multiple is consistent.
As I said, every multiple has a numerator and a denominator. If your numerator is an equity value, your denominator has to be an equity value as well. If your numerator is a firm or an enterprise value, your denominator has to be a firm or an enterprise value as well. You have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Let me back up. Let's take P/E ratios. Think of what's in the numerator. It's the market value of equity, right? And in the denominator, you have earnings per share, which is equity earnings divided by the number of shares, which is okay. Thank God for small blessings. The most widely used multiple in the world is consistent.
To recap, every multiple has a numerator and a denominator. Both the top and bottom number have to be consistent, meaning both numbers must be either an equity value or enterprise value. You should not mix and match them. For a better understanding, check out our video on equity value versus enterprise value. Inconsistent multiples. What's wrong with an inconsistent multiple?
Okay, so here's what's not consistent: a price-to-EBITDA ratio. And here's why it's not consistent. Your price is a market value of equity. EBITDA is an operating cash flow. You say, what's wrong if I use it and I'm consistent? I use it for all 15, 20 companies in my sector. It's still not going to work. And here's why. If you have companies that borrow a lot of money, let's say they borrow money to buy back stock, their market value of equity will drop, right? But their EBITDA will not be affected by the borrowing. Those companies are going to look cheap to you. If you mismatch your numerator and your denominator, use equity value in the numerator and use a pre-debt value in the denominator, you're going to find companies that borrow a lot of money look cheap to you for all the wrong reasons. So check your multiple to make sure it's internally consistent. Second, make sure it's estimated exactly the same way for all 15 companies in your sector. It's actually a tougher test to meet than it sounds. If using price-earnings ratios, here's what I'm asking you. Is earnings per share estimated exactly the same way for all 15 companies? That doesn't just require that you have the same accounting standards, right? You need all companies to have the same amount of fidelity to those accounting standards. If they don't, aggressive companies are going to look cheap to you. So watch out.
Let's unpack this Professor Damodaran statement and review why the price to EBITDA is inconsistent. Remember, price is an equity value and EBITDA is an enterprise value. An equity number is procured from the stock market. EBITDA is based on internal enterprise accounting records. In his example, he shows that a price to EBITDA could be manipulated or corrupted by a company borrowing money to decrease the numerator. Still, the denominator would stay the same, causing the company to look cheap. For example, a company is currently priced at $10 and has an EBITDA, earnings, of $2.50 per share. Essentially, what we're saying is the company is priced 4 times its earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and appreciation. Now, let's assume the company borrows billions of dollars to buy back stock, cutting the market cap in half, so the price per share is now $5 and the price to EBITDA is now 2 times, making the stock look cheap. Not accounting for the change in market price, the company just transferred the debt from equity holders to bondholders. In Aswath's example, he states that if you have companies that borrow a lot of money, let's say they borrow money to buy back stock, the market value of equity will drop, right? Let's review why. Because in theory, a stock buyback should not affect the price per share of a company's stock. Suppose a company has 10 million shares outstanding priced at $5 each. The company's equity is worth $50 million. This valuation is known as the company's equity value, market cap, or market value. The company's equity obligations can be erased with buybacks and debt. Now, the company's board of directors decide to buy back 10% of the shares outstanding, or 1 million shares for $5 each. Since the company has spent $5 million in cash, the remaining equity is worth $45 million. The new market capitalization of $45 million is calculated by multiplying the new number of shares outstanding, 9 million, times the price of $5. We can see the market cap has declined from $50 million to $45 million. However, in real markets, the buyback might push up the price of the stock. This may be because the announcement of buybacks might cause people to think it's a good buy, or because of the supply and demand of shares. If it's a good company and they're taking a supply of shares out of the market, the price should go up. For example, if by the end of the buyback the price goes up to $5.28 from $5, the new market cap is roughly $47.5 million. Step 2. Describe the multiple. The multitudes of people using multiples every day have no idea about statistics and cross-sectional distributions. That puts them at a disadvantage because it's hard to know whether the multiple or price is too high or low. On wealthbranch.com, we provide the statistics you need to make a better judgment. To have a better understanding of this section, you may want to check out our video, 5 Statistics Terms in Less Than 10 Minutes.
Second step in the process, describe the multiple. As I said, this is basic statistics. When you have a lot of data, put it up in a distribution. Because what you're going to get a sense of when you put up this distribution is what's high, what's low, what's typical. One of the things you're going to see when you put up the histogram, and you're going to see a few in the next few sessions of each of these multiples, is none of them is symmetric. Why? Because a multiple can never be lower than 0. A price-earnings ratio cannot be less than 0. But it can be 15,000, 20,000, 25,000. You're saying, so what? When you have a distribution where the lowest value is 0 and the highest number could be any number, your averages are going to get pulled out by those outliers. I remember what my stat professor said in my first statistics class. He said, if you have an asymmetric distribution, a distribution where the outliers are all on one side, he said, trust the median, not the average. So we'll look at the statistics of these distributions, but it's good to look at the data. 25 or 30 years ago, you could have had the excuse of saying it's too much work. That's no longer true. Today, we have the data to look at, and there is really no basis for rules of thumb if you don't have the data to back up those rules of thumb.
Step 3. Analyze the multiple. The purpose of analyzing the multiple is to understand and test the fundamentals, assumptions, and relationships of the variables that drive each multiple. In other words, you want to understand the mechanics of the multiple and the assumptions being plugged into these formulas.
Third, analyze the distribution. As I said, embedded in every multiple are all of the assumptions you make in discounted cash flow valuation. Assumptions about cash flows, assumptions about growth, assumptions about risk. So there are 2 questions you're trying to answer here. When I use a multiple, what are the variables that should determine that multiple? Second, how do changes in those variables affect my multiple? So for instance, if you tell me that the variables that matter are growth and risk, how does change in growth affect this multiple? You think that's going to be really difficult to do. Not really. Here's a very simple rubric you can use for finding out the variables that drive a multiple. If you have an equity multiple, price-earnings ratio, price to book, go back to a very simple equity valuation model. The simplest one I can think of is a dividend discount model, a stable growth dividend discount model. The value of a stock is the expected dividend next year divided by the cost of equity minus the growth, right? Divide both sides of that equation by a constant. So for instance, if I divide both sides by earnings per share, I end up with an equation for the price-earnings ratio. That'll tell me what the variables are that drive the price-earnings ratio. If I have an enterprise value multiple, go back to a very simple enterprise valuation model. Enterprise value is free cash flow to the firm next year divided by cost of capital minus growth rate. Do the algebra. As you will see in the coming sessions, that's going to allow us to come up with the variables that drive each multiple. And once you have those variables, the rest becomes straightforward. You can control for differences. You can look to see why some companies are cheap and others are expensive. So define, describe, analyze. And if you go through these 3 steps, then you're ready to apply. And when you get ready to apply, there are two basic questions you have to answer. What am I going to call comparable here? What are those comparable firms? And the answer might seem simple. You might say, I'm a software company. It's other software companies. But that's not necessarily the truth. A comparable firm from a valuation perspective is a company with similar cash flows, similar growth, and similar risk. And guess what? If you're Microsoft, none of those companies might be software companies. So think in fundamental terms and think of ways in which you can control for differences on those fundamentals. Storytelling is not going to be enough. So one of the things we're going to talk about in these coming sessions is how to control for differences in ways in which it goes beyond the storytelling. So let's review. Most people use relative valuation and most people use it shortly. So if you're going to use multiples and comparables, and I think it's a good idea to know how to do it at least, even if you're a believer in intrinsic valuation.
Step 4. Apply the multiple. The fourth step is to use the multiple for comparison or in relative valuations, but only after you have 1. Defined the multiple, 2. Described the multiple, 3. Analyzed the multiple, 4. Only then should you use that multiple in an application.